Hello, this is Naser Hussain, Radio Dawn Station Manager, live on Premier Institute, Facebook, and YouTube. And I hope you're joining us today because we've got a special session for all our followers and listeners today. And this will also be recorded, so you can watch this at a later date. And I'll also request if you could share it amongst your friends and families, so the people who may need this, who may need to listen to the lecture, can benefit from it. I've got a special guest with me today. It's about BAME. As you know, we're talking about the BAME community here. It's about mental health recovery support after lockdown. As you know, last Monday, we came out of the COVID restrictions and seems so far so good. And we hope it continues as such. And hopefully the COVID cases do reduce and we can continue with life as normal as it was pre-COVID. So the session today is about helping people to protect and recover their mental health well-being during and after the pandemic, and can prevent more severe mental health problems from taking hold. I've got a special guest with me today who's an expert in this field, and I'm really grateful for him taking time out to join us. But I just want to say beforehand that this session has been organised with Premier Institute and Diversity Watch in collaboration with Near Neighbours and Radio Dawn. I just want to welcome our special guest today, Shepherd Nhariwa. Hello, Shepherd. I hope I pronounced the surname correctly.
Yes, that's correct, Naser. Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, before we go on to Shepherd, I just want to read something out about him. Now, this is a very long section here. I told Shepherd that it may take about half an hour to read, on which he can expand on later. But I just want to give you a very brief bio about Shepherd, because we want to know more about who we're having a conversation. Because it's not an interview, it's a conversation with Shepherd. He's an expert in this field. So we want to know more about him before we start asking questions in relation to this field. So Shepherd Nhariwa is a business development and training consultant who has broad experience of working within the young people services in the NHS and private mental health care services. He has a background of a BA degree in English and literature, has an English literature and art teacher, as an entrepreneur, as well as aspiring to be a philanthropist too. He has also worked as a consultant in business development and strategy. He has experience of a BSc degree in mental health nursing, working in mental health services as a qualified registered nurse specialist. He has worked extensively as a mental health practitioner within child and adolescent mental health services, as a CPN, which is a community psychiatric nurse. Within NHS mental health services across England and North Wales, and in early intervention psychosis services for adults and young people, carrying out mental health assessments. He has previously worked as a clinical lead for several reputable mental health care companies in England in a capacity as a hospital manager, and eventually established himself as a service development and training consultant for various private mental health services and the NHS in England, leading to establishing a mental health consultancy service known as SFDNE, that's a mouthful, Service for Delivering New Ethos, which involves work with various professionals such as art therapists, psychologists, and other clinicians. He also helps services in mental health to establish policies and procedures. He has also helped to formulate artistic skills in various ways that promote appropriate therapeutic processes. He currently continues to work with various business organizations as a consultant. I think we're finished for the day. What do you think, Shepherd?
Yes,
Shepherd, that's absolutely fantastic. I wish I could have that kind of background as well, but hey, I don't. Maybe something to aspire to. Fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. So, yeah. Shepherd, once again, welcome to our exclusive session today. And I hope many people out there can benefit, because it's a very important subject, especially during COVID, because during this pandemic, a lot of people are self-isolated. And even today, people are still self-isolating due to COVID-19. And I think it's very important that we reach people's homes through the online service, which we are thankful for having this service available, where people can actually listen and benefit from people like yourselves. Thank you once again, Shepherd. I just want to I've mentioned about yourself, but that was just in terms of your qualifications. But in terms of your own experience, what made you go into this kind of field beforehand?
I think for me, it sort of stemmed from having been a former teacher. I was a high school teacher in my former life in Zimbabwe, where I'm originally from. And I started to obviously take interest in young people's behaviors, mental health. You know, as part of teacher training, you get to do things like you learn psychology as a whole, in terms of like child development and how people, think, that sort of thing. So psychology was one of the subjects that really interested me. And then as you do, you work a job and you're teaching, you're marking books, at home, and like a pile of like 35 to 40 exercise books you've got to go through. And it all became quite monotonous. And I thought to myself, obviously, I progressed on to come to England in '96, came over and started to think about ways I could work with young people, but not in a teaching capacity, but more in a supportive capacity of identifying what help they need, basically, young people, that is. So I basically started going through the process of establishing how I could actually do some sort of work around young people. So I went into mental health. So ended up with at Keele University, where I did my mental health training, nurse training. But basically, from then on, I took an interest in young people's services, where I was on placement and started working towards a career in that sort of side of things, if that makes sense. So literally wanted to establish more of how to support young people with mental health difficulties. And it then obviously progressed from then on, specializing in the CAMS, the child and adolescent mental health services, across the board, for most of my career within the mental health side of nursing when I first started out, and then developed to working with adults as well. Yeah.
So I think, having worked as a teacher beforehand and working with young people and their parents, it would have given you some sort of foundation and understanding, seeing what people go through. And then when you went into mental health training, you could use those experiences and develop upon them.
Sure. Particularly when you think of the behavioral aspects of young people, as well as behavior experienced by the parents, for example, what they went through emotionally. So I took quite an interest in that side of things.
Yeah. So mental health is a broad subject. It could mean different things. So for today's session, what is the definition of mental illness?
Well, in a nutshell, really, trying to also stick to the sort of layman's terms, really, I think I would say mental health is centered around difficulties around emotional emotional sort of emotional and well-being of people, in terms of how that may go wrong. So we all experience emotions, we all go through emotions, and it is when those emotions start to become unrealistic to some extent, where you start to have difficulty in expressing your emotions, or you start to face trouble with how you understand what's happening around you. For instance, to term mental health in a nutshell, I would say it is when things emotionally, and well-being wise, start to go wrong, where things are not particularly going well for an individual, to a point where it's affecting their ability to cope with the day-to-day living activities. For example, if you can't get up in the morning, for example, for some reason, if you can't do what you would normally do under normal circumstances, that in itself can lead to some kind of diagnosis, if you like, of mental health. But having said that, it's not something you just wake up and say you've got mental health. It's more of you've got to be assessed. There are specific things that would be assessed, and usually the start of that would be, maybe you're not feeling well, you're going to the GP, maybe the GP picks up a couple of things and starts to realize that there is potentially a mental health difficulty that you might be facing as an individual. Hope I've made sense so far.
Yeah. I mean, research tends to indicate that everyone has some sort of mental health. Now, whether it's at a small level or if it's at a high level, but everyone suffers somewhere down the line. Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that, particularly because we all have a certain degree of mental health difficulties, if you like. I like to put it as difficulties sometimes, because it's an experience that each individual will have in their own sort of ways. I could, Neza, I could have my own experiences. You could have your own experiences. How you cope with something. Something you might find quite challenging, I might find not as challenging. Does that make sense? You know,
Mm.
so how we all cope with certain different situations determines the level of impact it will have in our well-being, in our mental health, how we cope with it emotionally. Yeah.
So I know you touched upon it just a short while ago, but
Yeah.
how would I know that I'm suffering to a level where I actually need to get some help before it gets even further? How would I identify that myself?
Yes, yes. I think that's quite an important question. Thanks for asking that. You will find that it can be quite difficult sometimes to actually admit that there is a problem, because you might feel one particular way one day, something is totally different, something is off. You know, you wake up, you just don't feel like getting up, for example. I like to use examples that are simpler because I don't want to complicate things with that.
Sure.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is, say you're just having difficulty waking up, you can't do your usual routine, you are not even keen to speak to anyone, you know, you just don't do what you're supposed to do, sort of thing. So that in itself could still mean you are just tired. You could be just physically going through some changes in your body, etc. You know, but once you start to see that it becomes a prolonged thing, you start to question, maybe you could question yourself that something's not right here, but you can't put your finger on it, you know, and that usually is the case with a lot of people, which is why you'll find when there is a hint of a mental health problem, some people are quick to say, no, 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 I don't have that. Because one, there's the stigma around that. Two, you don't want to be seen as a weak person, depending on who you are and where you're from, you know, culturally as well, those sort of issues, which we'll probably touch on as we go along. But these are things that you start to notice. But I think your best bet would be to go to the GP. I always say this to people. First port of call is GP,
Yeah.
want to be seen. You have a feeling something's not quite right. You know, I think you kind of sense that you're down, your body's not reacting the way it would normally react in situations, or you know, you're not really your bubbly self, sort of thing. Yeah.
I think it's a good point that you mentioned about sometimes you don't feel, you know, if it's a man, especially, think because of the macho image, you think, you know, it makes me look weak, makes me feel
Yeah.
weak if I was to come out
Yes,
with it.
that's
So you
very
probably hide within yourself. I think the benefit there of having a good company of people like friends and family, a large group, is that they can identify these issues and maybe, you know, get you that support and discuss that with you. So if you have a group of people, then I think in a way it's fantastic because you have that access to people who can support you in such a, you know, position before
yes.
it goes any further. So would you suggest that speak to your friends and family first or something before going to expert help, or do you say
I,
just get straight away to the
I
GP? Or
think so. I mean, again, depending on the individuals, I think some
yeah,
people find they have a good relationship with certain individuals and they have that trust with those individuals. I've come across a lot of people, and I can be like that myself, where you trust your partner, for example, a lot more than you would trust going to the GP. First of all, you know, we might have a sense of, how do I put it, paranoia, especially around this COVID period, where someone can be paranoid about anything that they're given, be it medication or whatever, because sometimes people view a mental health problem as, oh gosh, if I go, they're going to just pump me with meds or something. You know what I mean?
well,
It
yeah,
sounds silly to say, but some people naturally may think like that. So talking therapies, as they say, that could be a sense of talking therapy. You're talking to somebody. I could feel a sense of relief talking to you about the difficulty I have, you know, and so that might be a source of comfort to talk to someone that you feel comfortable with. But they might feel it's the magnitude of it might be quite a lot that they won't be
yeah.
able to to you
Yeah,
know.
I mean, sometimes that relief can come in the form of just letting something off your chest, and just having someone to speak to you, let it off your chest, you instantly
Yes.
feel better, don't you? So
Oh
sometimes,
yes, 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 certainly. Some people get to that point where I've spoken to sir, I'm okay, I'm good now. I don't need to go anywhere else any further. But then again, until something else probably builds up. So that's where they say sometimes don't let things bottle up. You might feel I've spoken to so and so, but another day, another week, another month, or down the line, something else comes on top of what you experienced initially. That's why I think you get people who hardly want to be seen as weak, talking to anyone. They bottle it up until it gets to the point where they might shock us. Something happens, something drastic happens, and it triggers something, that brings about immediate, action that's
Yeah.
required as a matter of urgency, which sometimes that in itself may be quite overwhelming for someone who's never been faced with that situation. All of a sudden, they're thrown into hospital and they're forced to remain there, uh, you know, against their own free will. Sometimes these things happen that way, where because of an incident that has happened, it's not showing the point where you could have sought help while things were a lot calmer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. Now, obviously, I know you touched upon COVID-19 at the beginning. Can you explain the impact of COVID-19 on people's mental health? Has it caused an issue, do you think?
I think it has quite greatly so, because as you and I know, COVID just hit us from nowhere. It just became quite a massive crisis for all of us across the world, globally. So I think there's been so much of the anxiety about the future as well. If you can imagine already people that already had a hint of mental health problems, and then COVID hits. Now, if you can imagine what the impact is going to be on an individual that was already faced with all sorts of issues prior to COVID. So you'll find that, yeah, it has hit hard in the sense that so many changes for a lot of people, for instance, losing jobs, or being in a situation where the companies have folded because, they can't keep up with the whole situation happening with COVID, becoming more and more in most cases where people have lost their lives, people have lost their loved ones. And so the impact, the list of issues around that, is quite a lengthy one, really. I mean, I would say it has really hit hard because some people are still trying to heal from the initial impact it had on them.
Fantastic. Now, obviously, we feel that adults are in a better position to explain their situation, that have more experience, being old and so on. But do you think children and adolescents also get affected by mental health? Are they good at explaining the issue?
Yes, children do get, definitely. It has been proven that children definitely are affected by mental health. In fact, they do suffer from mental health as well. I mean, when I worked in the child and adolescent mental health services, when I first had the experience of learning a lot more about mental health in young people, in children, I was surprised to see one of the units that was opposite the one I worked in initially, an inpatient unit. It was actually for younger children, as in younger than 13, going further down as young as 5, I think, if I recall very well. So you'll find that people could question, how does a child have mental health? Yes. And again, this is where you have the skills of the professionals that work closely with young people, of assessing the level of impact anything in relation to the well-being of a younger child has on them. So you'll find that there might be a situation where they don't identify with it because they don't know what's going through their mind, what's happening with them. So usually parents or adults start to pick up on things. They start to realize what's happening. They start to think along the lines of, we seek help. And usually, again, the doctor situation where they have to access the GP. GP then obviously assesses as well. And sometimes GP can't do much, so they've got to then refer it to a particular case to a child consultant, consultant psychiatrist. And then I think, again, there's an assessment process there that is carried out to establish the level of mental health problems that a particular child might have. Yeah, and you'll be surprised, there's so many things that trigger those sort of mental health problems for young people, for children. So in answer to your question again, sorry, I seem to have gone around a bit with that, but in answer to that, obviously COVID has hit everyone hard, and again, mentally, it would affect children. So it certainly does. Mental health does certainly affect children as well, and young people.
I mean, one of the questions I asked you earlier was, how does one know if he or she is suffering from mental illness? I think as an adult, I can listen to you and I think, well, I understand what he's saying now.
Yeah.
But in terms of children, it may be more difficult for them to understand that.
Yes.
So as a parent, how would I know if my child is going through, I mean, I know you say, like, for example, if you get up in the morning, you don't feel like, you're getting up, you want to stay in bed all day, you don't want to speak to anyone. So these are signs we know that something going on there. So as a parent, how would I know my child's not lacking in certain vitamin or something, they're actually suffering from it? How can I identify that?
I think
is there a way?
Yeah, there is. I think, again, observing your child, every parent knows each child's behavior. Yeah, each child's behavior. Yeah, they sort of work towards looking at what the problem is with their child, what they're going through, how they can actually adjust to the situation with their child. For example, is something affecting you? Is something bothering you? So those sort of questions initially, as a parent, you would sort of ask the child.
Because obviously with children up to a certain age, they're at school anyway. Now, sometimes, for example, it could be harassment at school or bullying, which could cause these issues. So if a child says, I don't want to go to school in the morning, and we're forcing them to go to school, saying, no, you're okay, you're fine. And then this bullying could have a severe impact on them, which could lead to further mental health illness. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's right, because schools are a good source of identifying change in behavior, for example. So at home, like I said earlier, you have a change of behavior, a change of how things are for that child. If they're behaving in a certain way, you can identify and say, right, I think we have an issue here. We can't communicate with our child. We have an issue. How do we deal with it? And then you start to question as well, what's happening at school? What's happening at school, where the child cannot speak to the teachers aren't clear what's going on, and they look at the behaviors that they report to you. So it leads to those further ongoing problems, that they start to realize that there is obviously an issue here. We have to refer it. And that's how these cases get to be known. Does that make sense? So you get to know about something not quite right following a number of things that are investigated from a point of view of the school, the parents, or it could even be, depending on the child themselves, if they just report to their parents. Sometimes they don't know what's going on themselves. Yeah, I hope I've answered that question.
Yeah, that's fine. It makes sense. Yeah. So do you think, because obviously a lot of it's COVID related that we're talking about today, because obviously we just recently come out of the restrictions and we don't know if we're going to go back into it. But do you think the pandemic and the lockdown have had the greatest impact on mental health within the BAME community?
Yes, mostly so, because I think sometimes there is a lack of recognition of the possibility that there could be mental health, because culturally sometimes, I mean, I'm African and I look at my own sort of culture, where back in Zimbabwe, in my own original country, you'll find sometimes mental health is not identified that easily, because there is a particular way of thinking that, no, there must be some sort of, I don't know, some people believe in like spiritual attack or some kind of issue that is centered on, people not quite understanding that it's not that there are mental health problems that are not identified. Yeah.
So do you believe that culture plays a big part in this?
So sorry, say that again.
So do you believe culture plays a big part in
Yes.
the BAME community in
Yes,
terms of recognizing this illness and coming out with it as well?
I
Trying to get
do
the help.
believe that. Yeah, I think there are kids who might face problems with families, and families might believe, oh, there's something wrong with this child. You know, there's some kind of demon. You know, it sounds crazy when you say it, but some people strongly believe that it's not mental health. There is some element of some sort of demonizing thing that's there, that's existing, that's causing a situation to take place. So families then struggle to understand if they've not had someone that might point out or point to them into the right direction to say, I think you need to investigate this through this route of checking whether there's a mental health problem. So mental health, like I say, in different cultures is seen in a different way, if that makes sense. You know, it's seen in so many different ways.
Fantastic. So obviously we've had, in terms of COVID, the lockdown, we've had it for about 13, 14 months, and now that the restrictions have been removed, how can individuals in the BAME community who may be suffering from this illness reintegrate back into society? Because at the moment, if you go around, people still think they're in the lockdown. They get confused
Yes,
about why people are taking
yes.
masks off and so on. So
Yeah,
how do you think?
yeah, it is quite a confusing time, really, because some people aren't yet as clued up about what are the new regulations, what are we still needing to wear masks, for example, that's the thing. But I think reintegrating is also based on how you've identified with the difficulties. Have you acknowledged that you've had so much of the difficulties that have literally caused you to feel the different way that you have felt? We've all been affected by COVID one way or the other, you know, facing deaths in the family, like I mentioned earlier, grieving, you know, that sort of thing. So reintegrating now, trying to get back to normality, seems like quite a difficult task to start with, but I think once people start to recognize how they've been affected, what has been the issue. For example, if mental health has been prevalent amongst groups of people, um, who do we turn to? What do we do? How do we manage this in the future if there should be yet another pandemic, for example, other than COVID? You know, there could potentially be other issues that might spring up in the future. So reintegrating is all dependent on how individuals seek help, how they identify where the help is, um, where can I get this help? If they've had, you know, some people have done quite a fair bit of researching on it to understand what it's about, what can be done to help each other as groups, and who do we turn to? You know, the mainstream has a lot to offer across the board for all sorts of different backgrounds. You know, people, I mean, a lot of people still have this notion that there isn't help for certain groups, but there is across the board.
So in terms of now, I mean, what resources and support do you think is available for people within the BAME community who are still suffering from this pandemic-related mental health issues? So like, you know, debt, fear, worry, stress, these kind of issues.
Yeah. I think you'll find that a lot of the BAME community have had already existing resources in place that they've utilized. For example, churches, you know, people find comfort in going to church, they seek counsel in churches, you know, and that has had some great source of support for them where they are supported around mental health problems. Then there are also particular sort of resources in the form of, you know, brochure, you know, like booklets or leaflets, if you like, you know, things that can actually get you to read more about mental health. So people are starting to see that they can go to specific places that are publicized now. I mean, I think there's a lot of awareness being put across the different communities about what's available. I think you'll find in GP practices, there are leaflets as well that you come across that give an indication of where people could get help. And I think what's good about it is that a lot of them have got the translations into the different languages, which is what I've found to be quite helpful.
I think the point that you mentioned about religious places of worship, I think that's a good point you mentioned, because people who've got access to, who are certain member of a certain, basically what I'm saying is, if you're a member of a certain religion or a club or an organization, then you've already got a base there, haven't you? So which you can access now that you're out of the pandemic. So you've already got a resource that you can actually use to help you out.
Yes. I think you'll find I've always found the internet to be a broader source of, it's a broad resource, if you like, because it can take you to all sorts of different information, And I think if we can encourage individuals to go through that
sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say, if we can encourage individuals to go through that process as well, to identify, like Google, I always look at Google as a good source, because it will give you information about what's local to you as an individual. Some people, I think the struggle is the language barrier. And I think in some cases, they would need to seek the family support again. There are always individuals within families who are much more clued up about things more than the others, sort of thing. So I think that's another way to come together. And in some communities, because of community centers, that there is now some sort of outreach process that's existing. I know for a fact there are a couple. I mean, obviously because of time constraints, it's difficult to sort of start running through a list of all the different places that they are. But I know within Nottingham, there are specific centers where they give you that sort of support. I know there are some counseling services as well for individuals, because people always think that the GP will always have all the answers, but the GPs, as we all know, what they tend to do is just use the information that's been presented to them, and they will then refer accordingly. And even when they have referred accordingly, you'll find that the team that has had the referral, that has received a referral, say for instance, of a child who is unwell, possibly suffering from mental health problems, or it could be behavioral problems or any other difficulty. Sometimes it's a mixture of physical and mental, or well-being, or emotional well-being needs that need to be catered for. So you'll find there's that balance that also people have got to try and balance that out and see, okay, how do we deal with the mental health issue? Sometimes the physical issue may trigger a mental health issue, So I think going back to what you're asking about, I think it's important that people start to identify with resource centers around where they are, the sort of centers that can offer more help for them. And sometimes a lot of those are just a phone call away, or just click on your laptop, desktop, even phones. You have also, many people might not be aware of this, but there are so many apps. Even if you look at your Google apps, or whether be it an iPhone or an Android phone, you will always have access to quite a broad list of apps that can help to deal with some mental health difficulties. And some of them have questionnaires as well that will kind of pre-assess what the difficulty might be for you. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So I mean, at the moment, obviously, I know it's good that you mentioned apps, because at the moment we're just talking about centers or people that we can get access to, or somewhere where we can go. But one thing that we've seen during the pandemic is a lot of people, they've been so isolated and working from home, so they're accessing more online services, such as Google, like you mentioned. They're working from home. They're using Microsoft Teams, for example, a lot of Zoom. And do you think technology has had a negative or a positive impact, including social media, on children and adults? Is it negative or positive? What would you say?
I would say, to start with, there's always something negative, I guess, to some extent. There is a negative element in relation to some of the problems that do trigger mental health problems. can be triggered by the social media,
Mm.
platform. For example, if you've got Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whichever, you'll find a lot of stuff can trigger problems for people. Then you also have some of those platforms being utilized for a bit of humor. So from a point of view of comfort, and we find COVID has caused so much, the lockdowns have caused so much of individuals being on their phones, for example, for whatever reasons, where a lot of us have been glued onto our phones, laptops, tablets, that sort of thing, where some of the content we access is not necessarily great for us. So I'm still looking at the negative side of it to some extent. And then you'll find that some of the potential difficulties can't be managed once certain things spiral out of control within the social media side of things. And that in itself can cause so much of the mental health difficulties. I'll give you an example. Sometimes you'd see, obviously without mentioning any names or anything, but you'd see an individual who will complain about how they feel so depressed because they've seen the next person has a better life than they have, simply because they've seen it on that person's profile. They've seen pictures, and it paints quite a picture of a life of luxury, for example, and which they might not have, So that in itself can bring people down, So in terms of the social media aspect, technology in that sense can be quite unpleasant, if you like. But then on the other hand, it can be very helpful because you are looking at, for example, what we're doing now. We wouldn't be able to do this, I would have had to come into your studios to conduct this, but because of this technology, we're able to do it from the comforts of our homes. I'm able to talk to you from my home and, that sort of thing. Again, you look at the benefits, you will find technology will also help us to be in touch with the very same platforms that can help us cope with our situations. Like you say, we've had entertainment through the same technology. We've had educational parts of our lives through this entertainment. We've had to carry out work through this sort of form of, technology. So I think both sides you can find the pros and cons, if you like.
Yeah, personally myself, I find it a massive bonus having the social media where you can access people that you would never have been able to get access to, organizations, businesses that you never been access to. And but sometimes I think people may think it's information overload, isn't it? Which causes the mental, which spikes it.
It can be,
initially.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a way to prevent mental illness? Do you think, is there a way to prevent it, or is it there's no way, it's just whatever level you're at?
I would never say there's no way of preventing, I would say I think with like anything else, some people can argue, like for example, physical illness or certain things.
Yeah.
Some can argue there is a way to prevent certain things. But when you talk about emotional well-being, a person's well-being, there are circumstances sometimes that inevitably come into our lives, and we have no control of them, if you like. But I think what's important is how we started to identify with the problems, or the difficulties, or if you like, the illness, because obviously mental difficulties it's an illness situation as well, But some people try to equate illness mentally with physical illness, and they say, oh no, the other is better than the other. But no, it's all illness, if you like. You're struggling for whatever reason you struggle. I would say there are some sort of preventative things that I think that's where we think of the well-being of people. People go to the gym, people do the exercise and that sort of thing. People take walks, people walk their dogs. People do all sorts of different things, and they deal with life differently.
Yeah.
They deal with a situation. For them, that's why you hear sometimes someone saying, oh, I like to do this because it's therapeutic for me. I like to walk my dog. I like to play the guitar. I like to play a bit of sport. I like to literally do a bit of dancing or something like that, you see. So I think those are preventative.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to the saying, what we were saying earlier, that it's everyone suffers from some sort of mental health.
Yes.
So
yes,
it's not really about preventing, it's about how best to manage it according to your needs and situation.
Yes. And you'll find some people will automatically think, oh, someone's been diagnosed with mental health. The quickest solution is, oh, what meds can they be put on? No, it's not always the case. You will find there are groups of people nowadays who will argue that it's not all about medication. It's about your mindset, how you cope, so you will find some people find relaxation to be good for them. You know, the yoga and things like that, you know, a lot of the therapeutic activities that I've kind of touched on, some of the things that help to make them feel better, if you like.
And I think within the BAME community, because we've got a lot of different communities that have moved into the UK, so obviously a lot of people may not have access to services which say white people would have. I'm saying white people in the sense that when we're living in a white country, I'm using on those terms. So the people from the BAME community, depending on which community within the BAME community it is, may feel that because of the being a minority within that community, they may not have access to those services. So now that obviously we've discussed what kind of resources and services available, so those people who may have been affected by this pandemic, what kind of now that obviously the lockdown is lifted, what can they do straight away? If I say to you, it's lifted now, I've been suffering, what should I do first? Where should I go first? What would you say?
Yeah, I think the important thing is to sort of know that they have access to their GP to start with. I always say that because if they've had a fear of going out there, being seen by people, etc., the lockdown has had that impact on them. So they are going to be quite wary of going out there. And sometimes there's that fear. What are people going to say about me?
Yeah.
You know, how am I going to be viewed? Are there going to be so many judgmental kind of, ways of thinking? Are people going to think that, you know, I'm not normal? You know, there's so many fears and anxieties with that in itself will bring even more difficulty for an individual. But I would say, the first thing I would always advise people, if there have been some difficulties, is to just seek that direct help, you know. And why I always bring in the issue of the GPs being the first, because normally, naturally, that's what you would do. If you're registered with a GP in your local area, they're the first people who would need to know anything that's amiss with yourself, because they then would identify what the right plan of action would be for you, you know, because sometimes you can just randomly go to people and they might not be in a position to help because they can't quantify, they can't, you know, put it in one particular sort of conclusion that, no, this is what you need, so therefore we're doing this. Whereas a GP can identify with what's going on and let you know which direction to take. So they'll signpost you, basically.
Yeah, and I think GP is a good means to get access to the right services.
Services, yes, exactly. So, for example, when I was working within CAMS, doing assessments within CAMS, we had some sort of referrals that are considered to be inappropriate. The reason they call them inappropriate because someone has referred their child to the CAMS service because they're just not listening to them, and it's an issue that's within the household where if you establish and investigate further, obviously you'd need to have that child brought in. And in actual fact, to have an assessment done where a referral has been made, to assess that, but sometimes you won't even get to the assessment point because you read the letter, you think, nah, this isn't fitting into the criteria of the sort of people that we would need to assess for mental health difficulty. And the same with adults, you know, if there is, say, for example, when I was working with this psychosis team, early intervention psychosis team, we have to establish, yes, there's this referral, but does this person have psychosis? If the question within the team, because just remember that that assessment is not just read by one person and then they dismiss it. No, it's taken to a multidisciplinary team that will work within that service. So if it's an account or child and adolescent mental health service team, they are going to scrutinize every detail of what has been put across in the referral. And the biggest question that's always asked is there a risk? You know, is there a risk to that person's life? You know, how great is that risk? So if it's a question of they're a risk to themselves or others, you know, and usually the way you're measuring that risk is by doing the appropriate assessments, asking the right kind of questions. You will also have someone who will be asked questions or an incident that has been highlighted as a really risky one is the reason why there is a matter of urgency for that particular person. As some people might not be aware, in mental health, they've also got the Mental Health Act that is used in a sense that will guide the decision making. If someone, say, has walked the streets naked, for example, and they are seeing that as normal, and there's quite an issue where someone is doing that, obviously it's going to raise eyebrows. What's going on? Something's definitely wrong there. So you need to assess that, and then you will find that sometimes it might lead to that person being placed under the Mental Health Act, where they call it like a Section 2, for example, where they'll be placed on that based on what has been presented as the risk. You know, if they're trying to hurt others, you know, in a sense, they could be potentially taken into hospital against their free will, but obviously their rights being read to them, and also them being made to understand why there's a need to keep them in hospital until they've been assessed fully. So, and sometimes part of that assessment is a prolonged assessment where within a number of days or a number of weeks or months, whichever, you know, you're trying to assess to see what the issues are. So consultant psychiatrists will identify with that. They will say, we've established that there is a diagnosis of a specific condition from a mental health point of view. Yeah, I hope I'm making sense there. Yeah.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. So you will find that people will have accessed the GP for a good reason. That GP will have known a lot of situations where they've had to direct a referral to the right place. And sometimes they may direct it and it will bounce back. No, we don't see an issue here, but we are pointing out, we're picking up a few things here and there. So we are signposting them to a more appropriate service that might just temporarily deal with the issue, you know, and then that's done and dusted. Yeah. So yeah, the GP is always, going back to that question again, the GP is always the right kind of place to direct it towards. But if people can talk, they can talk to each other. But if there's a need to expand on that and make sure you're ruling out everything else, I would say the GP is your best bet. Yeah.
Here's an interesting question for you. Now, we talked about earlier that culture could play a massive role in terms of coming out with the issues to people, or you feel that, you know, as a male, it might make you seem that you're weak. But as you mentioned, we talked about GP, going to the GP and so on. Do you feel another barrier for the BAME community could be that I don't want to speak to, or it's not racism, to a white person because they don't understand my culture, they wouldn't understand what I'm going through. I want to speak to someone who's come from my kind of background, so then they can understand me better, and then we can have a better relationship. Do you think that could be a barrier, that they don't have the right person in terms of people from the BAME community supporting them?
Yes, certainly. That would certainly be a major barrier. You're so right there, because you will find that the mistrust as well, and it goes way back to, again, cultural beliefs, for instance, or I can only speak to someone I can relate to, sort of thing. You find even with children, sometimes they can speak to someone that they think they can relate to. I've seen situations where young kids will have some sort of approach that isn't sitting well with them, and they just don't speak for that reason. Whereas you find an individual could come to a child, say, who likes, say, certain superhero, for example, and you come with that approach of, oh, do you like this or do you like that? And what's your best character in, say, the Marvel, heroes or whatever, that sort of thing. And then you start to get in with that and talk to that child in a sense that they can relate to you with. Does that make sense? Yeah. And then you'll find with the cultural side of things, for anyone like adults or whatever, for example, they can feel more confident to talk to someone who speaks their own language. So that's why you'll find some organizations will have people who can relate to a certain culture or relate to a certain language. It's, again, like you said, it's not like a racial divide type thing, but it's more of, we feel that person will be appropriate in approaching certain individuals, group of people, because the key issue here we all have to remember is to get the problem resolved, the help, sought, because otherwise, if they don't get the right help, then there's no way of approaching it, in terms of communication. So that can be a major barrier in people not wanting to be seen, not trusting doctors, for example, and maybe a certain doctor is not of a certain background, and that might sit, that they might not sit, it might not sit well with them, they might find that very difficult. So I always find it useful to explore other ways of getting through to people. And I find usually some sort of outreach that gets people to feel more comfortable with why they've got to go in and be seen, why they've got to seek the help, because sometimes inevitably people will have to be in hospital, they will have to be hospitalized. And that's where you get people who are interpreters coming in handy, in relation to, this is what these people are doing. They're trying to offer you help. It is quite important and vital that you accept the help that you're being given, So, but the barrier is there, you're right. Again, culturally, some people do not believe in actually going to seek help for mental health. They believe it's another avenue that they could seek rather than go to the right people. Mm.
What I mean is, are we reaching out to people, or are we waiting for them to come to us? Are we doing enough of reaching out to people? So if that's the case, then that support has been provided. Do you think that's the case, or are we just sitting back and waiting for them to come to us if they feel they need the help?
I think there's a bit of both, really. I think you will find certain services work differently. Some services actually go out of their way to reach out to people. There are, I know for a fact, in a lot of cases, I've worked with some individuals who started some services in mental health, who have started to actually work with young people in schools. Like, they will do an outreach through teachers who become equipped with mental health awareness, for example, and they are known as champions within mental health champions within a school environment, for example, like a high school or primary school. So, and some head teachers are going to specific trainings themselves so that they can come back to the school and equip other teachers with what they've learned from the mainstream in relation to mental health and well-being issues. So in a sense, indirectly, sometimes we are reaching out, and then you have people who are literally physically going in to reach out, because sometimes you don't reach out when there isn't a particular problem. You see what I mean? So I think in terms of resources being spared as well, you would reach out only when someone has come to you, if that makes sense. So if they've come to you, they've presented themselves, or someone else has presented them as having a need, then you deal with what's been presented. Yeah.
So do you think it's important? It seems to make sense now, but do you think it's important that more resources should be put into schools in training and teaching youngsters? Because as they get older, they're a bit better tackle them rather than tackling them at an older age where they may have gone through so many years of it, and now it's very difficult for them to change from that habit.
That's true, because you'll find a lot of, when it comes to children, some things spring up because there are certain emotional situations they've had to deal with that they've never been explored. They've never had that explored from a therapeutic point of view, and they become more and more, challenging in a sense. It's quite difficult for them to cope because so many things have gone, you know, without being checked, or, you know, a lot of things have gone unnoticed, and it causes more problems in the future for them as adults. You know? Yeah. So that's what we struggle with, really.
Fantastic. Shepherd, once again, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate your taking time out. It's been very interesting. I've learned quite a lot, so I'm impressed.
Yeah, it's a topic that we could go on and on about, really. But I think
for hours.
the thing is to try and keep on exploring, keep on finding ways to manage it, keep on identifying with services that exist that can help. And there's so much online that you can actually find.
So, Shepherd, for all these people that may be watching now, I may watch this at a later date, is there any final words of advice you'd like to give, or any information? Or
I think the key thing for me would be, I would say to people, if there is something that's, you know, going right for you as an individual or as groups of people, I would say try and speak to someone, you know, someone close to them. And where there is a barrier, try and identify the best sort of option that would be easily available. Because sometimes it's about just getting the right kind of person to talk to. And that person, who knows, might then, you know, assist you to reach out to the right kind of people that can particularly help professionally. And I think it is always good to seek professional help. And again, I go back to the GP issue. Go to the GP, make that call, find out if there is anything. It could be a child, it could be an adult, it could be someone older, you know, where something is not quite right. And given what we've all come out of, you know, the lockdowns, the pandemic, you know, all the strife from all of that, and a lot of loss and a lot of people grieving, I would say there are always organizations that will be able to help. You've got like so many of those, the list is quite broad, you know, but there are so many that you could support and help.
Excellent, thank you very much. So just for the listeners and viewers out there, please do share this seminar, this session widely, share it with all your friends and family, and tell them to pass it on to others, because you don't know who may need this help, who's not comfortable in coming out with this. So this will be a great opportunity for them to see, and obviously getting this expert advice from Shepherd Nhariwa, who's an expert in this field. And it's an honor to have somebody who's actually working in the field, rather than someone who's just talking from like textbook style, but someone who's actually involved in the community, someone who's from the BAME community, who can share this information. I think it's a fantastic resource. And I just want to say, obviously, this session was brought to you by Creamy Institute in collaboration with Diversity Watch, Near Neighbours, and Radio Dawn. And it's a fantastic bunch of organizations working together. It's fantastic. I hope we can expand more, and we can get more organizations working together and tackling this issue. And let's smash it, you know, let's work together and get these issues resolved within the BAME community. Thank you once again, Shepherd. And I hope we can see you again in another session.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Take care.